So we're here because we all experience death, and death is not equally experienced. And in particular, queer and trans communities have experienced and continue to experience disproportionate amounts of death. And so death and dying and grief is something that is particularly has a lot of unique aspects for queer and trans folks. And I'm really mindful, especially coming into this month and this programming made possible by Reimagine, which I'll thank them in just a sec, but that for many of our queer and trans ancestors, their identities were erased through death and through the ways they were memorialized. So in service of really thinking about that, I am also aware how much queer and trans communities have so much to teach all of us about death and dying and grief, and about what it means to celebrate life, and about what it means to be in our bodies and be embodied and create meaningful practices. So that's kind of just the context for the conversation that we're going to navigate tonight with these incredible panelists. We'll have about like an hour's worth of discussion followed by some time for Q&A. So we just invite you to, as you're listening, to share questions in the chat. And for how much we have time for, we'll pick a little to bring out during our Q&A session. And then I'll moderate those. One other comment, since the chat is open, that's just a reminder that we are all here to acknowledge the experiences of our panelists and recognize that everything that our panelists are sharing is their truth. And so any kinds of harassment won't be tolerated in this space. If there is any, you'll just be promptly removed. So we really appreciate everyone holding a loving, centering space together. And so I'll first just introduce myself really quickly. I'm Ari Simon. I'm a facilitator, coach, an engagement practitioner. I, about a year and a half ago, had this idea for a community learning group called Queering Death, which 2 rounds have happened now. And in the Queering Death cohorts, we've really been looking at this intersection with first people in the LA area, and then we expanded it to all across North America, really looking at sort of the intersections between death and dying and grief and queerness and queering. And in that, something that kept coming up in both of our cohorts was this question of what does it mean to healthily grieve? And what do we need to healthily grieve? And one of the answers kept being that one of the needs is spiritual resources and spiritual care. And then many of our participants, particularly trans and queer folks, just named how much of a barrier to entry they feel like there is around spiritual care for them, of growing up with faiths or religions that excluded them, that dehumanized them, that made them feel like they couldn't access that. And so this really just speaks as a question near and dear to my heart as someone who practices their Jewish ancestral faith, as someone who practices in the container of Zen Buddhism, and as just someone who really resonates with spiritual care. So with that, that's kind of how we're coming into this conversation today. Before I introduce our panelists, I just want to thank Reimagine so much for their commitment to conversations like this and to being a space where we can all really process what it means to die and what it means to die with dignity and what it means to healthily grieve. I also really want to thank MJHS Hospice and Palliative Care, and I want to give a really special shout out to Plaza Jewish Community Chapel in New York City, Just give Stephanie Gary from Plaza a moment to just say hello. I'm so appreciative of Stephanie and the work that Plaza is doing to really think about what it means to center trans and non-binary lives in matters of death and dying. So Stephanie, you want to say a quick hello?
Thank you, Ari. And yes, good afternoon, good evening. It's a true honor for Plaza Jewish Community Chapel to be sponsoring this conversation with MJHS. Just for those of you who don't know, Plaza Jewish Community Chapel is the only not-for-profit Jewish funeral chapel in New York City. Our mission is to ensure that every member of the Jewish community receive a dignified end-of-life experience. We are also interested in taking the profit motive out of this very sacred experience and to provide education and bereavement support around end-of-life conversation. We pride ourselves in providing sacred service to all, especially to those in underserved communities. We are determined to ensure that everyone receive access, receive respect, and quality care as we move forward in a world that has texture and that is colorful and diverse. We all must continue to listen, to grow, and to care for one another. Our funeral directors at Plaza guide our families through challenging conversations, and we're always aware of the importance that these conversations hold. And we know how important they are to have before they're needed. So it's really a privilege for me to be learning from this wonderful, wonderful panel. Thank you to Reimagine, to Andy Engel, and of course, Ari Simon. It was just a few months ago that you and I started to talk about what this might look like, and here we are. So again, I want you to know it truly is an honor for me, for Plaza, to be part of this most sacred conversation tonight. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. And yeah, thanks, Andy at Reimagine for throwing the links in the chat. Okay, so without further ado, the reason we're really here is because of these incredible panelists in the room. I'm so excited to introduce and be in conversation with. Just to glorify them a little bit because they deserve it. We have Rabbi Becky Silverstein here from Boston, one of the founders of the Trans Halachic Project and housed at Sfaro, which Rabbi Becky, I'm sure, may talk about. We have Q Haley coming in from New York, who is received a Master's of Divinity focusing in womanist queer ethics, currently serving as a staff chaplain at New York Presbyterian Brooklyn Methodist Hospital. We have Reverend Lewis Mitchell, who is one of the founding members of Transfaith and former executive director, and now serving as the bridge pastor of Al-Key United Church of Christ in Seattle. Pastor Lewis, thank you so much for being here. We have Sid Yang, who is an energy healer through their practice Blue Jaguar Healing Arts, also a senior advisor for healing justice and wellness at the Movement Voter Project. Sid, I'm so glad you're here, also coming from LA, as I usually am. And last but not least, Reverend Lindsay Biggs, who is currently a spiritual care counselor at VNSNY, Brooklyn South Hospice, also with a Master's of Divinity from Union Theological Seminary. So nice to see you, so glad you're all here. I want to start the conversation just by kind of allowing you all to introduce yourself a little bit through this question that I'd love you to all answer, which is, how does your spiritual work support people in living and dying queer? What does that mean to you in your work practice? So maybe Rabbi Becky, would you like to start?
Yeah, happily. thank you, Ari, for the invitation to be here with y'all tonight. I'm just excited to get to learn with everyone here. So maybe just a sentence about what my spiritual work is, and what is the framework that I work and live in, which is the work of deepening connection to Torah, broadly defined, and to Jewish tradition, people's connections to our ancestry and their own Jewish ancestries, or their own Jewish journeys if they're Jews by choice. And I do that work to ensure that Judaism itself is growing and deepening, that the Torah itself remains as vibrant and meaningful and relevant as it can. Because if the Torah becomes stagnant, it can no longer provide support and meaning and structure for us as people. And so we are in this relationship of deepening Torah's existence in the world, and Torah deepens our possibility to be human and in the world. And I do much of that work in the framework of queer and trans community. I do that because Torah can only be revealed through our own lived experiences. And the more lived experiences come into contact with sacred text, the more of that sacred text gets shown through the world. We could also frame that as the more of the divine that gets shown through the world as well. So that's my big why I do any of the work that I do, which is scattered all over the place. And some of that work is about long-term cultural change work. It's about supporting the people who are working within Jewish institutions to really confront the ways in which misogyny and homophobia and transphobia are parts of our tradition and institutions. It's spiritual work in that it allows me to be with all people and to encourage them to be vulnerable and ask the ways in which those things are functioning in their own lives. I do work also to create space for queer and trans folks to engage in spiritual practice, mostly through my work at Sfara, where we engage in Talmud learning, but also singing and mikvahs in the lake, jumping in the lake, and all sorts of other fun things together. And I would say the other piece of my work is pushing the Jewish tradition itself to center queer and trans lives. And I do that work through the Trans Halacha Project, through this project that says halacha, or halacha, depending on your orientation to Hebrew in any moment, is poorly translated as Jewish law, and hasn't centered queer and trans lives. And so when a queer or trans person says, how does this aspect of Jewish law apply to me? We have to figure out how we fit into an already existing framework. And the Trans Halacha Project is maybe not. Maybe we can just create our own frameworks and start from the base, start from the Torah, work our way through and see what happens, instead of putting us in terms of mostly cisgender, heteronormative, patriarchal tradition, flip that script and say, what do we need and how can we get it? I think all of this supports dying well too, right? Because folks are deepening their connection to spiritual community and are finding tools, I hope, that they need to be resilient and present in their lives as they approach death, and as they are in communities that wrestle with folks who are dying. I'll pause there.
Yeah, there's so much there. Thank you for that. Pastor Lewis, maybe I'll turn it over to you.
First, I want to say thank you for allowing me to be here and apologize because I'm sitting at the airport in Orlando. So it's a little noisy here and not ideal, but I'll do the best I can. I aspire to be a presence with people, specifically queer and trans people, in living and dying. And that actually began for me long before trans faith or ordination. It began in pandemic 1, the AIDS pandemic, when I was invited to journey with people of varying identities in the queer and trans umbrella, for lack of a better term, because I was the only one they knew who prayed, even though I was personally taking a hiatus from the Christian church out of my severe church burn and disappointment. And I showed up. I just showed up for people and for parents and for friends and for anybody. And more of that, not because I knew what I was doing, but because I felt heart led to just be present and wing it, apologize when I screwed up, and just be present with people. And what I found in some of that journey, there's so much life that happens in the final journey to death. There's so much fullness there that if there is a safety, a presence, a witnessing, a journeying with, that it can be one of the most fruitful experiences for the person who is transitioning. I feel honored to have been there. I aspire to continue to do that and to not be trapped by the denominational or Abrahamic veils that I wear. I'm a firm believer that if you claim to understand God, you've probably made your God too small. And so I honor people of traditions that I understand and that I don't. I just want to journey with and be an essence of love and light where and when I can.
Thank you, Pastor Lewis. Sid, how about you?
Yeah, so hello, everyone. And it's still light outside, so, good afternoon. So I enter this work as an energy healer and as a spiritual counselor, really from a place of believing that spiritual space and religious practice is not where I belong. So I was raised in a pretty fundamentalist evangelical Christian community, very, very tight-knit, very insular community. And for me, as somebody who's queer and trans and coming out in those spaces, I'm like, I can't be here, right? And yet there is this deep calling, which is also very confusing, of wanting to lead a very spiritual life and walk a very spiritual path. And it was very confusing because I'm like, well, I'm not allowed to be in these spaces. I'm not allowed to do this work, but this calling is so strong. I don't know how not to do it, right? And so for me, it's been this conflicted path. And where I've ended up is through recovery work. So a lot of the work that I do as an energy healer and a spiritual coach right now and a spiritual counselor is working with primarily queer and trans folks and folks of color around eating disorder recovery, around the ways that self-harm shows up in our bodies and addiction shows up in our bodies as appropriate responses for living in a world where oppression tells us that our bodies are wrong, we should not exist, we do not belong. And so I work from that framework, and how do I hold spirituality from that? And currently, where I am right now in my spiritual practice is I'm a practicing Buddhist. I consider myself, I've reclaimed Buddhism as somebody who is Taiwanese American, but was raised, Christian. And in this path is also, and I'll probably talk about this a little bit more, but I'm starting an MDiv program in Buddhist chaplaincy in like 2 months, which is very exciting, as a way to really deepen this work. But so much of that really has been conversations with myself, with the divine, with the natural world, with Buddhist teachings of, is there a place for me as a queer person, as a trans person, to be in spiritual relationship with myself, with others? And how do I do that in relationship to the ways that living and dying is this ongoing process, right? That one of the things I think that has been so powerful for me in this work is that, and my spiritual practice is that when, in Christianity, it was like, when you die, then you get to figure out if you're good enough for God, or then you get to figure out if, there's that judgment piece, right? That happens after you die. And so that's what I was taught, right? And yet, so there's this happens, then death happens. But my practice now and in the Buddhist path that I walk is death is happening every single day, right? Every single moment, there is a death that happens in every single breath. And how do I sit with that loss, with that grief? How do I sit with others without presuming to know anybody else's spiritual path? Right? That if our work is my work is to sit with people as they encounter and access wisdom. and access the divine and access compassion, that what that journey looks like is we're going to be encountering death in every single breath that we take together. And we're going to be encountering living in every single breath together. And how do I get to queer that with the folks that I work with? So there's a constant learning from the folks I work with, from my clients, in my own practice. And I'm excited to share some of that with you all today, but also really so here to learn from everybody else on this panel today. So thank you.
Yeah, and I'm just loving that dimension of queering death also, of both, like, of course, in the literal sense of our no longer living in this body, and in just being willing to hold that this is, we're talking about something that, as you say, is happening in every single breath, it's happening at every single moment, and that I think has a really unique aspect, particularly for people who move out of and in of identities throughout life, that we'll get more into, I'm sure. Q, how about you? Would love to hear your take on how your spiritual work supports people in living and dying queer.
Thank you for having me. One of the things that, so I run an org called Free Zone for Us, which is for queer trans people of color. And I also am a chaplain in the hospital, which, you know, the waters are a little muddied in the hospital as far as knowing who is queer, who is trans, who is, you know, a lot of times people aren't necessarily out, or there's not enough time to be able to engage in, you know, intimate relationships in a way, you know. So one of the things that is important to me is to be able to engage in radical vulnerability for people that, you know, if I have an inkling, or if someone has, you know, taken a liking to me in a way that I think, particularly in the hospital, they may be identifying as queer trans. One of the ways that I do that is by how I show up. I engage in a ministry of presence in the hospital just for my visibility at first. You know, I am intentionally, you know, massive center at work. And I think that is a way of me combating all the things that I heard growing up. You know, you must be ladylike. You know, you must present a certain way. So I think there's a sacredness in that, even just showing up in that way, and being present for people to see someone that they might identify as, or identify like at the hospital, particularly when we are part of a care team where, you know, in the chaplaincy world, there is not a lot of Black women, first and foremost, and there's not a lot of Black queer women that are out in the hospital settings. I'll say that, I'll speak from that perspective. So just me being there in general is very meaningful. So how can I invoke the sacred? How can I show people that there is a sacredness within them? And these are the principles that I utilize when I'm, you know, creating convenings for Free Zone for Us as well. Is, you know, how is the sacred going to show up? Because the sacred does show up when one or two queer people get together. So in engaging that radical vulnerability, being able to share parts of myself that I wouldn't be able to, it kind of gives someone the permission to share parts of themselves in ways that they normally wouldn't, particularly in the hospital context, you know. So I've had experiences where I've walked into rooms and, you know, there's a queer person in the room and they were like, I haven't felt comfortable here until I met you. You know, and it's not me, the person, I'm another queer person in the hospital space for them. And there was a sacred exchange between us, and the divine was present in that moment. And I think a lot of us do have some sort of religious institution hurt. So cultivating those moments of community, even if they're brief, is a way of providing life as we all are dying. You know, I think that's one of the realities, is that how do we talk about the fact that death is inevitable? And every day we are closer to our death than we were before. So again, invoking the sacred in that, and being able to show that we are worthy of respect, we are worthy of love, we are worthy of care in our life as we are transitioning to our death. And then what does a good death look like? How do we die with dignity at end of life, while we are also again, traversing to are deaf. So these are all ways that I try and show up in my, my org and also in the hospital space. I also sit on several committees. So these are things that I bring in. Oftentimes people don't have the worldview to think through, oh, well, a queer and trans person's end of life care is going to look different than someone who is straight. So what are the things that we need to do in the hospital to be providing that care? These are also things that I bring, into the work that I do. That's a part of my spiritual practice is being able to name the things in spaces where people usually don't have access or wouldn't have access unless they are working. So yeah, that's just a little bit of what I'm doing.
Thank you so much. I mean, I'm really hearing how, and I feel like this is something I want to like echo to everyone here, every queer and trans person who's with us right now is like, just by merely showing up as exactly who you are, by just being you and your mere presence creates this like sacred connection that being our identities create. I just thanks Q for that. Excited to get more into that. Lindsay, last but not least, so there's much more to say, but yeah, would love to hear from you.
Hello. Oh my goodness. I feel like I'm in the presence of just so much wisdom. I'm so thankful to be here with you all. My name is Lindsay, and I'm an ordained Episcopal priest. My day job is I work as a hospice chaplain, so I'm constantly addressing and assessing for spiritual and emotional distress with my patients and their families. And I also do LGBTQ spiritual care education, primarily for chaplains, and just help other chaplains learn how to see us, to how to know us. How I was teaching a workshop this morning, and my favorite phrase is one I learned from one of my teachers, Rabbi Joe Hirschman, and is narrative flexibility. I love exposing my students to queer narratives, to trans narratives, to gay and lesbian and bisexual and asexual narratives, so that when they enter those rooms, they can see people for who they are and all the complex intersections that that person's might be encountering in that moment. So that's a huge passion of mine. Next spring, I'll be teaching a course at Union Theological Seminary where Q and I went. And so I'm really, really excited to work with those seminarians. Yes, oh, well, so hospice and palliative care, I think even just the philosophy in and of itself is pretty queer. So in medicine, you really have a hierarchical structure. In the hospital, you know where you stand. Most people know where they are in that hierarchical structure. And but in palliative care and hospice, we work interdisciplinary. So everyone is discussing, everyone's lens and point of view is informing each other's, and maybe the doctor or the nurse or the social worker or the chaplain, maybe one of us can't make inroads with this patient, but another person can. And maybe someone has an insight that another person doesn't. And so we're kind of functioning as this care group, which really transgresses these hierarchies in medicine. And I find that element of being a chaplain deeply meaningful. Yeah, one of the things I love to do with my students is really teach them how to advocate for queer and trans people in these medical spaces, because yeah, the I hate the words cultural competency. I prefer cultural humility, but for the sake of mass understanding, you know, the cultural competency in our medical professionals isn't always there, and it often harms people. And so just helping even the medical people on my team understand, like, when you misgender our patient, it's not only illegal, and you could get sued, but also, you know, you are a healthcare professional who's causing harm, and that is not okay. You know, and also helping them, bringing them along to understand how to treat our patients with the dignity and respect every human being deserves. So I could talk about death for the rest of the night, but I'm going to stop here so that we can move on to our next question, because I'm so excited to just hear more of the insight coming from this fabulous group of humans.
Yeah, this is so great. I'm already hearing a lot around kind of something I mentioned in sort of just introducing like why we're here, which is just around the barriers to entry that I think can be so high for queer and trans folks in particular, thanks to just so much pre-existing trauma, exclusion, harm caused. So yeah, I'd love us to just kind of get into this by talking about just like what the repair process looks like to you and in your respective communities. Because I think that that's such a necessary first step here in some level. So yeah, I'm curious if who might want to jump in.
I will say this quickly while there's a lull in traffic. Lindsay, one of the things you said really struck me. I tell my current congregation, who are really well-intended, middle-aged and older, white, cis, straight, liberal people in Seattle, that you cannot serve who you will not see. And we have to start with that. We have to start with adjusting our lenses to see who people are and respond to that, rather than respond to those things that we learned in a book somewhere or saw in a movie and then apply to everyone that we meet. And so, you know, one of the things that is about repair is continuing to lift up the challenges that people face. I weekly list the number of trans people who have been murdered over the course of the year, because this isn't news that they get. And I want them to be aware of what it is that I carry with me into every week. And I'll say this very quickly. When I applied for this job, I told them, you know, I'm aware that you're aware that I'm a demographic gold mine for you. Let me tell you what that's going to cost you. I don't do optics of a thing. We're either going to do the substance or we're going to talk about why. And so every week, every opportunity, I am lifting up what I'm dealing with during the course of the week in my unpaid ministries with individuals around the country and around the world. It's important to keep having people readjust their lenses and to recognize that it will be painful for them to realize that they've been bigoted, because they don't see themselves in that way. And it's hard and it's painful and it's a pain they have to go through to avoid causing pain to others. So that's how I began addressing some of that harm, and really just having people readjust their lenses. And, you know, you can call it calling out or calling in, whichever feels most comfortable for you. And I will say this now, just so people can get it out of the way. As a minister, I cuss a lot. So what I'm saying is I will call bullshit at any opportunity with whomever, because I'm not having it. I'm not having it. And I correct people in mid-sermon when they start with brothers and sisters. I'm like, excuse me, that's not going to work for me. How you going to have this big old trans and rainbow flag out here and you've just alienated anybody that doesn't fit into that binary? I need you to fix that right now. And so that makes me a bad guy, and I'm good with that.
I love you. You're amazing. I think that really touched on a personal death, I think, that's of mine, I think, that I've experienced in the pandemic. which I think has been a difficult one as a religious leader, is just the death of my my caring about any sort of respectability politics. You know, I think the pandemic really just stripped any of that away. And so it's just so encouraging to hear you, Pastor, speak. Just put that in those beautiful words. In answering your question, Ari, about the repair, so for a time, so chaplains do residencies in hospitals, and for a time I was doing a residency at Mount Sinai, and one of my placements there was the Center for Transgender Medicine and Surgery, and I was seeing outpatient folks who were experiencing some sort of spiritual distress and wanted to speak with someone about that. And an assessment, so in chaplaincy, we have different assessment tools, and one of the assessment tools I really relied on is called the R-COPE. It's just R and the word cope. There's also a version of it called the J-COPE that is a lot more Jewish. But basically the idea of it is that as a clinician, that and as I'm hearing a story, I'm I'm assessing whether or not people's religious or spiritual engagement is part of, and I don't like this binary, but positive or negative coping. Is someone telling me a story about irreparable harm caused at the hands of religion? Is the God they were taught of as a child conflated with their abusive parent? If so, that might not be the source of healing and the place we're going to go right now to find good coping. But then there's also this other group of people who, even if they've experienced negative things from their religion of origin or their family of origin, weaponizing religion or spirituality, that they have still held on to something, some connection to the divine that has gotten them through difficult times. And that person might, benefit from like deconstructing some of the other stuff to let that spark thrive. And so that's one of the tools I use when I'm engaging with people to just, help kind of, I feel like a religious and spiritual paths for a lot of us is kind of like peeling back the parts of it that are painful, the parts of it that are wounding us, and the parts of us that are helping us thrive, because they're so intertwined. They're so intertwined that even just being able to name the parts of us the parts of it that are painful and the parts of it that are helping us thrive can help us claim and have agency over the future of our spiritual or religious engagement.
I'm gonna follow behind you. Oh, sorry.
No, Q, go ahead.
Because you were exactly what you're speaking about is my own experience, being the one who is in a home that is harmful and having to stay there. And I think part of the repair of that situation was recognizing the grief that comes with that. We talk about grief in terms of death, but grief is actually just separation, any separation from a thing. So we oftentimes grieve the living. And I know part of my healing process and a part of my repair was recognizing that I went through years and years of grief of someone who's living. The relationship was severed with the parent, but there was extreme grief in that. And my responses to that at times were unhealthy. I went into modes of unhealthy and healthy. I had some healthy coping, but there were times where I was healthily coping. And I think it's important to be able to engage people in those conversations and remind them that, wait, no, just because this person is still living, they caused you harm. And that is a form of grief when that separation occurs. So how do we have more conversations about grieving the living as queer and trans people, is particularly around when they cause great harm? Or how do we have more conversations about forgiveness of self for what we do to survive while we are in these extreme situations? Particularly thinking about the pandemic now, all of our siblings who are in toxic homes because they have no other choice or no other place to be. There is going to be a grieving process when they leave that space, and how do we hold space for them in that? That's the way that I visualize repair, more on an intimate and personal level of remembering that we do grieve the living. We go through the whole grief process, all of the stages, and our body responds to that, and we hold that grief in us. So how do we allow ourselves, or how do we help people push that grief through?
I'll just add a few more things. I really appreciate what's been shared so far, and this piece around how grieving and loss is such a lived experience for many queer and trans folks. I mean, all humans, right? And especially for those of us in queer and trans bodies and in queer and trans spaces. And I think for me, that repair is really looking at like, what are relationships? How do we rebuild connection? How do we reweave connection in our relationships? Because so many relationships become severed in the coming out processes, right? Because it's never a moment. In recovery, since I work with folks in addiction recovery and in eating disorder recovery, that there's constant repair in that, and there's constant loss in that, loss of self, loss of sense of self, lots of relationships. And so how do we re-sew or reweave and build relationships? And for me, that is a form of repair in that grieving process. And one of the ways I like to frame recovery work, since that's like the core of my work, is that recovery is a practice, and it is about reclaiming the right to exist. And it's about being in a continuation of existence and saying, I still am here. And in addition to that, I am here, right? So it's the both and. And why I think that's really important when we're talking about grieving and death and dying is this sense of, in order to continue to exist, we have to encounter death along the way and say, even so, in that survival, I am still here. And that my existence, my full existence as a being, allows for and invites in others to expand out their own existence, but their own possibilities. And so if we can hold this as like that recovery and repair is about existing, then how expansive can we become in our communities, in our relationships, in our practices with each other, so that those ways of, when we encounter loss, because we will, and when we encounter death, because we will, and we do, that it doesn't take us out as individuals, but we're held within this larger, what's that word, like an ecosystem of care. And how are we building those relationships, both to the sacred, to ourselves, to each other, so that we're able to keep that continuation of existence going.
I love that. Just so appreciating what I'm really hearing, which is this, like, the idea of, in terms of answering this question of what do repair processes looks like, that grieving itself is kind of the repair process that is like, it's inherent. And yeah, just cue you naming it, just about like, how do we have more conversations about grieving the living as people who are excluded, and just what a beautiful way of framing recovery as reclaiming the right to exist. Yeah, that's yeah, I want to just kind of keep playing off of that, like reclaiming the right to exist, because that again is like what I think we're really sort of what traditionally has like has queer and trans people up against is this lack of the right to exist, and that then death itself becomes this place of erasure of who you are and your right to exist as who you are. And so I'm curious, it may be a little similar to the intro, but just to get a little bit deeper into like, you know, kind of who's here and how you got here. I'd love to hear a little bit about how you center your own queerness and your queer reclamation in your spiritual practice. And just by extension, maybe how that creates more space for you and others to show up to death and dying and grief work. Anyone want to jump in on that?
Again, I'm trying to jump in when I have windows, when there's less interference. So if I lose connection with you, I will at least enjoy this amount of connection.
At least we had a little.
What you said, Sid. As a person in recovery, I frame how I do church more how I did recovery than how I learned to do church, because that to me is more wholeness. And so like we're claiming the right to exist, but we're claiming the right to exist in wholeness, in truth. Church gives you, my church, let me rephrase, my church of my upbringing gave me lots of room to exist in a very narrow paradigm. And as someone who was assigned female at birth and then raised with those narrow binary, sexist, patriarchal, submissive constructs, the notion that I deserve to take space, even in my manhood, has been challenging because I'm having to unlearn all the bullshit that they taught me growing up. So, you know, how I live in my own transness and my own queerness and my own embodiment has been a challenge. And I will say to you honestly, as someone who spent the first 39 years of my life pretending that I only had a body from the neck up and everything below that was fantasy, it has taken me all these years to actually strive to develop any kind of healthy relationship with my embodiment. And it has been a struggle in a world that is anti-Black and anti-fat and anti-queer and anti-trans. All that I am is given back to me in various forms as being something that needs to be erased and not take space. So my first step in this is looking at my own embodiment and going, yeah, you know, I don't look like The Rock, but for all I know, The Rock don't look like The Rock when he wakes up in the morning. You know, I don't know. But I'm going to love that my body has brought me through all the things that many did not survive. I'm going to start with that. You know, I'm still here. I'm 60 years old. I am like 37 years older than I ever wanted to be. 40, I can't do math now. 37 years older than I ever wanted to be. And between the moments of trying to take my own life and others trying to take my life, that I am here as a testament to the resilience that is in me, even without my connection to it, and also the magic that I think is a part of all transits. And I will just admit, I think that we're magical. We are people who saw truth in ourselves and then brought it into an external place in whatever ways we chose. There is nothing that we can't do when we realize and recognize our power, that which we are built to be. We are built to be powerful intersectionalists and alchemists.
I'm trying to figure out how to pick up after that. And the place I'm sitting with is being 39 and also this year thinking about what happens in my body below my neck and feeling like, all right, I appreciate that, Pastor. It's just sweet to have that connection and be like, right, this is a thing. This is a thing trans people do. And I'm looking at my notes where it says like, this is hard, right? It's hard to be a trans Jew and a trans rabbi and to like wake up and say like, and look at a text and be like, this text is embedded with shit I don't believe, right? About gender, about relationships, about God, and is also filled with so many things I do believe. And so I spend a lot of time sitting in my trans identity and my spiritual my faith, being like, right, I'm here. And knowing that I need to sit, stand, move solidly in that space to be able to offer that presence to people. And that my people know, right? The queer and trans folks I intersect with, they know when I'm having a bad gender day. They feel it. Right? It comes through even on Zoom. It comes through even on Zoom when we're not talking about gender, when we're talking about Aramaic grammar, right? They're like, something's a little off with Becky today. And so I spend time, right? Like just giving myself, right? Like sort of the pep talk that I just experienced Pastor Lewis giving me a minute ago. And I do that because I know I deserve that dignity. And I remind myself that Judaism demands that of me, that what Judaism asks is that we show up we Jews and humanity shows up fully, right, in the world and sees each other as people and sees each other, if you use God language, as reflections of God, and sees each other as people for who deserve to have dignity and to have love and to participate fully in the world. And there are so many barriers to that. Even for me as like a white, wealthy trans guy, there are so many barriers to that. You know, and I think the piece that I'm sitting with too around magic and transness is this piece about being trans, forcing me to like answer the big questions in life, right? Answer this question of like, who am I meant to be? What are the relationships that are important to me? Who are my ancestors? What's the legacy I want to leave, right? Like all of these things, right? Like, and those questions, I take tremendous comfort in knowing that I will not, you know, if God willing, I face I have a sense of when I'm going to leave this world, right? We'll do so having spent time wrestling with these things, and they won't be sprung on me, and they won't be sprung on the folks with whom I have the great privilege of exploring them. I'll say one more thing, which is that I've spent a lot of time being the trans rabbi. Thank God there are more than one of us now, right? There's more than a million, more than 10 of us now. But spent the first 10 years, the first decade of my rabbi career being the trans rabbi, and paid the price for that, of actually like centering my queerness and my transness and the ways in which that was exhausting, and the ways in which people played out their misogyny and transphobia and their own crap on my body. And so also am aware of the risk of that, of the consequences of saying like, I deserve to be here. And also that doesn't give you permission, you random human being, to use me either. So I'll pause there.
I want to just jump in really quickly and just to echo this piece around the existence piece is about wholeness, right? And how much of that wholeness is also a personal journey, and a personal inquiry of like, what is my wholeness? What is my relationship to the all that is, whether that's the natural world, whether that's the Dharma for me, whether it's the divine, all of that, but what is my relationship to that? And so I feel like for me, how I bring my transness and my queerness into this practice or into my work is that it's a practice, right? That it's a daily practice. It's a daily inquiry every single day of the inquiry of being in this body. That there are times when I don't know what it means to be embodied, right? And I have histories of addiction and eating disorders, which are very embodied ways of being, but I don't always understand what it means to be embodied in this body, right? So there's this constant inquiry of what does that mean? And what does that mean to be in the desire of this body? The desire to lean into and follow a spiritual calling, the desire to be a sexual being in the world, the desire to exist and to wake up in the morning and be like, oh, I'm still here. I don't know, is that a good thing? Is that a complicated thing? But what are these desires, right? It's like that constant inquiry. And so where what gets exciting for me and how I get to be with this inquiry is I get to bring it into my practice with the folks I'm in relationship with and the folks, you know, I see and support through my healing practice, is that we get to be in these cycles of inquiry around all of who we are. What is our wholeness? What does wholeness look like today? What does wholeness feel like today? What does that wholeness of grief feel like? What does our wholeness in our sacredness feel like? Maybe we can't access that in a given moment for whatever reason, and that's okay. And how do we sit with that? And one of the reasons, what I mentioned earlier, is I'm going into this MDiv program and this Buddhist chaplaincy program, is part of this is this longing in me to go deeper. And not just deeper with my own Buddhism and my own spiritual practice, but to go deeper in my relationship and how I hold space with others around ritual, around practice, around beingness. And can that continue to expand out the ways that all of us can navigate suffering in this world and can ultimately experience getting free or experience liberation? And I see that work as this is my queerness showing up, is constantly being in inquiry. Because, you know, as a queer person, nobody said, well, this is the way you get to be it. This is how you are queer, right? It's constantly like, I don't know. And I think that that for me is very much a sacred question, is I don't know. And there's a humility that comes with that. And there's possibility that comes with that. And so how do we do that in relationship and together? And I think so much of this work, in the work that I do as an energy healer, is very much about making sure that as queer and trans folks and folks of color in recovery, we don't go through any of this alone. And that there is that relationship, that weaving together, so that our wholeness is not just my wholeness, it's our wholeness and our collective liberation that we are breathing into, practicing into, hopefully living into.
Yeah, I feel like that's a really beautiful segue into a slightly thorny question that I'm excited to hear you all talk about, as I have my own questions around it too. And just in thinking about that community and that togetherness and that not aloneness. You know, I think we're in a really interesting moment of wrestling between the idea of inclusion and, you know, these organizations that are, you know, may have a history of not necessarily being welcoming to queer and trans folks or not centering them, but now are trying to open the doors and want to integrate, want to be inclusive, want to be a safe space, and wrestling with that versus, you know, spaces that are really for us, by us, spaces that are exclusive to just trans and non-binary folks, spaces that are exclusive to, you know, QT BIPOC folks. And so I'm just curious, yeah, you know, and as like as a white gender fluid non-binary facilitator, it's something that I wrestle with too. Where are the spaces even in bringing this together? You know, those questions are on my mind. And so, yeah, I'd love to hear just sort of your thoughts on sort of what that balance looks like, or how you sort of navigate that in your own practices.
I'll go ahead and start. I think for me, as a person who was, I don't know where I stand, Black Baptist minister, queer Baptist minister, and has been kicked out of a church for being queer, I kind of longed for that. We talked about this earlier, you know, longing for that space, longing for that connection. It's communal. I feel when I go to church, I'm fed. And going to a church now that accepts me and being around people who have decided to leave the church altogether, having conversations with them, they shared that sense of longing, you know, but still wrestling with what does religion and spirituality mean to me now? How does God show up for me? So as I you know, went through Union, I talked with some people, and this is how Free Zone for Us started as a queer trans people of color organization, thinking about what does the sacred queer imagination look like? You know, how does the sacred show up when queer people of color are in one space, in one room? You know, whether we're engaging in ritual, whether we're engaging in a circle. And one thing that is also always a part of my convenings is food. You know, that fellowship of being at the table together, looking at each other in the eye, and holding space in that way. There's something sacred in that as well. So again, you know, as I thought further through the sacred queer imagination, I was thinking about how do we create connections? You know, how do we create solidarity amongst ourselves? You know, when these spaces are not accepting us in the ways that our own space does, because I think it is important to be able to have a space to fall into where you are fully seen. And I don't believe in fully safe spaces. I don't know how I feel about the language of brave space either. But I do think there is something about having sacred space that everyone can receive something that they need. They can see parts of themselves. And that allows you to, you know, feel some sort of healing. You know, in the moments where you don't know where your community is, or you see your community being torn down. Take Pride, for example, and how capitalism is just gross. Being able to go into this space with your own folks, and be held, loved unconditionally, is something that's important and sacred.
I love that idea, Q, of the sacred space instead of the safe space. I also am with you on that. And Sid, I really appreciated your reflections on wholeness. I think, you know, especially in the past year, I've really drawn on Buddhist sources to find my own wholeness, to find my own, you know, radical acceptance. And I think our internal world often mirrors, you know, our external world. How we interact with ourselves often is how we're interacting with the people around us. And I find that the more I can accept all the multitudes within myself, I can engage with the multitudes outside myself, you know, with limitations. We're all human. So yeah, that's been a huge source of healing for me. And I feel like a part of my own calling that I felt, regardless of the setting of my ministry, has just been to love myself and others as an invitation into wholeness. Like how can we know that we are worthwhile? Because we're so worthwhile. Yeah, and how do, when we see people and we embrace people in these sacred spaces, that do we call forth that from others? And how do we let others call forth that from us? Yeah.
I love thinking about that too, in the context of like not just how we meet people in the living, but how we meet people like in death and remembrance and memorialization too. That feels just very queer to me also. And sort of part of what's here, I think, in the reclamation is like really like by centering someone, whether they're living or not, like wholeness and identity, and their worthwhileness, therefore inherently it's like that's a reflection for ourselves too. Yeah. Any other sort of comments on this sort of question? Yeah, go ahead.
You know, that made my skin crawl a little bit as someone who's been around to engage with these mostly national organizations that have now sought to capitalize / repair with people of color and trans people and pretty much anyone in the community who is not an assimilationist. So I want to say here and now that my position is that assimilation and capitalism do a dance together within the LGBTQI community that sucks the life out of those of us that aren't trying to assimilate. And so there's a way in which, and I'll just say, you know, the task force, HRC, and folks like this that are now hiring, you know, trans folk and folk of color. And I'm happy about that. And I have friends that work there, and I'm happy they're getting a paycheck. I've not had an amends come from them yet. That's what I'm waiting for. I'm waiting for them to own the harm they've done before I can fully trust them. And that's the thing. I've been saying it for 20 years, but you know, at no point have they said, yeah, we have done some fucked up shit and hurt some people, and we're sorry. What they'll say is, hey, we're gonna do better now. Let's hire some people and do some things. I'm like, if you haven't made amends, I'm not sure that you really get where you went wrong. Having a person of color as your ED does not erase your history. It doesn't. Even if I like them, even if I love them, and I'm sure they're doing a great job, and I think their new heads are doing great jobs, but they're walking into an environment, you know, that is toxic. And as usual, they are carrying that toxicity with them in a way that calls their credibility into question, perhaps unfairly. So I mean, I've got some. I'm gonna have to add this stuff back to my resentment list, I guess. You know, I think that I've turned a corner on my expectations. I don't expect the large organizations to do what these smaller regional for and by organizations are there to do. I do expect them, if they wish to make amends, to seed money into these local and regional and smaller entities and stop sucking funding and not dispersing it to where it needs to be because you have some people of color and some trans people in your brochure. I'll stop there because really that's a whole other section.
Can I add one thing to that? I didn't know if you wanted to move on, Ari, but I think too, we have to, I feel pretty passionate about the cost of our time, the cost of our health, mental, physical health. What is the cost of creating change in these large organizations, whether they're religious or nonprofit? What is the cost? Our bodies are important. Our well-being is important. Our relationships are important. How we live is going to be how we die. And yeah, so I think there are people who, you know, feel that is where they need to be making this institutional change. But I feel very protective of them and of our people because I see the cost being so high. And I think that's one of the things that I have really, I feel like, learned on a cellular level through this last year of the COVID pandemic is just how disposable we are in a capitalist society. You can't work in healthcare and not see how disposable this society thinks we are. And so if we don't value our lives, if we don't value each other, if we don't consistently instill that worth in ourselves and each other, our workplaces aren't going to do that. You know, these institutions aren't going to do that. They will use what we give them. So we need to make sure we don't give them our everything, because we are of value. Our pain is just as valuable as our patients' pain. For those of us who work in the hospital, you know, we're all just people at the end of the day. And, you know, if we're not taking our own pain and our own well-being seriously, we really can't take the well-being and the pain of others seriously, because we're going to be avoiding it if we're avoiding that inside ourselves. So that's just some thoughts.
I think I want to share one thing, right? Definitely that pain resonates with me, and I shared that earlier. So one of the things that I've done maybe 2 years ago, what is time right now, right, is worked with a group of folks here in Boston with the Boston Chaver Kadisha, which is the sacred community that does ritual washing of Jewish bodies before they're buried to create new liturgy for non-binary folks. So much of Jewish ritual is gendered. We could talk about that for a long time, but let's not. So we got resources from a Jewish Family Foundation. We rewrote this. We paid a trans woman who's a rabbi to rewrite this liturgy for us, and it feels like tremendously valuable to make these small interventions. To me, at this point, that just like make people's life better, right? That just like answered one question. It felt like a technical fix to what is an adaptive problem, right? Like the adaptive problem is like, how do we handle gender in Judaism? And the technical question is like, what do we do when a non-binary person dies in our community? And so that's sort of like how I'm relating to Jewish institutional life these days, which is like, how can I provide these technical fixes that will make life better for queer and trans people while we're here, and before we build this, as we're building this other beautiful thing, right? And then I go and spend my time in this other beautiful Sparrow world, where we like spend a lot of time grieving the ways in which the Jewish institutional world doesn't want us, and also celebrating our lives. And so that's just, it feels like a unique thing from where I'm sitting that I wanted to throw out onto the table.
Yeah, thank you all. And thank you all for just sort of the honest candor here on this, and just really naming the need for spaces, for like, not just spaces, but for kind of this work to start in sort of the sacred, sacred space, or as Q calls it, in the queer sacred imaginary, and that like that queer sacredness, and that, yeah, I just, really hearing Pastor Lewis just like really speak some truth to, I'm just, that feels really resonant, especially right now amongst Pride Month, which is really complicated. So that's a whole another panel discussion of getting into that. But yeah, just appreciating, Lindsay, to your naming of like, yeah, we need to like take care of ourselves and be our whole selves. And, people, institutions, organizations, like just are going to need to see us and take us and work with us and deal with us as our whole selves too. Yeah, especially for just, if we are talking about death here, and death is something that in this country, in this like white supremacist capitalist patriarchal culture, is really institutionalized. And so I think this kind of leads me to a last question I want to ask before we move into maybe a little bit of Q&A is, recognizing that, what does it look like to you to teach queer and trans-centered death work? And I know we have other leaders and clergy and organizers and doulas here, and I want to just acknowledge and appreciate all of y'all for who attend to and walk the path of death work in this life. I'm so just sort of in awe of and humbled by that commitment that people make already. And yeah, so we'd just love to hear, Lindsay, I'm thinking of you and just naming the kind of clergy trainings that you have been doing, are going to be doing. Maybe you want to kick us off?
I'm going to turn my air conditioning off again. It gets loud. are you wanting me to describe the trainings I do for other chaplains,
A
or?
little, yeah, a little bit, just kind of, or at least bring us into just what to you, like, what does it look like to teach queer and trans-centered death care? Like, and how do you teach that? How is that something that is teachable to you?
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, on the hospice level, most recently, I've taught a group of hospice chaplains and also a group of hospice volunteers. So I think the folks who were in my trainings were already very oriented to like deep listening, being present, and have experiences of death. Um, uh, you know, the the grieving, the letting go that has been named already by folks. But I think when we center how I center our people's lives when I do trainings is, first off, I have a pedagogy that's really grounded in helping people teach themselves. So I often provide like a terms list or like homework ahead of time, because I'm not going to use my time to tell people what the word cisgender means. And it's just not a really good use of my time. And so when people show up, I have usually their questions and their kind of thoughts and feelings about the resources I've sent them. And then they're also in the practice of like using those things, those resources. And then when they show up, I have them apply those resources to actual case studies. So of course there's HIPAA, so I combine multiple narratives to kind of create a composite of real lived experience of folks at the end of life, and ways that their gender or sexuality intersected with the quality of care we provided or didn't provide. And so I usually, give that paragraph. And then I ask people to breathe and just observe what feelings come up for them, because countertransference is a huge real thing. So I think it's always just good to name what feelings it's bringing up for you, so we're not putting those on our patients. And then after that, I ask them how would you proceed with that, with this case? Like, so there's usually a dilemma at the end. How would you proceed with this? Like, what are the next steps? And then kind of talk them through those next steps of, what would be appropriate action and why. And people kind of fetter out different parts of the story and the narrative. And if they don't fetter them out, I fetter them out for them. And that way, I feel like people are really able to hear and see our stories and also feel them, because so much of understanding, I really feel that affect is as a modality of knowledge. It's when you feel something, when you have empathy for someone, you can, I think, get the facts a lot easier. So that's kind of my avenue. And then I always, offer more resources for them, and am available for questions. And yeah, I love teaching. It gives me a lot of joy when people have the aha moment. The aha moment is just so good. So.
Any other panelists want to jump in here of just what it means to you to teach this and have others sort of take this on? And while you're thinking, I'm also just even appreciating the silence, especially Lindsay, after what you just shared. I figured I would do it at the end, but maybe I'll just even do it right now, is kind of model what you just spoke about of giving people even a moment to just see how it feels. How does it land, you know? Already just, we're, coming towards the end of our time together, and there's a lot that's been shared here, and I would love to just invite all of us to, as Lindsay modeled, just take a breath and notice how you're feeling, how it feels to attend to this beautiful, sacred, queer, challenging conversation. Yeah, Pastor Lewis, if you're with us, give some sort of sign that you can hear me. um, maybe he's not. Just fine. Yeah, Sid, go for it.
Yeah, I can jump in just really quickly. I think one of the pieces in sitting in that moment of silence, so thank you for that. A piece that was coming up and how I work with my clients, and also I do have some students around the healing modalities that I work with, is this piece around how to sit with death and endings as a place of grounding and a place of stillness, and that we can, like an anchor in what is, right? An anchor in the chaos, an anchor in the unknown, is we know things are going to end. That's a given. So how can we, instead of fearing that, which is natural, right? I have a lot of fear around endings. But part of my practice is leaning into that ending as a grounding place. And I think that that is connected to the sacredness of death and the sacredness of endings and the sacredness of loss. But how do we make that? That's part of that practice that I talked about earlier. So I just wanted to bring that in, and how we can hold that in our bodies, and how I think as queer and trans folks and folks of color holding loss and endings, it's such an embodied experience. And I can speak as, as an Asian American in this moment, the death of our elders in recent attacks and violence, that's in my body too, right? So how I hold that, and I know that's not unique to me, but how do we hold that collectively? And how can I hold that as an opening, as a place of an opening, as an invitation or a portal into more wholeness? Yeah, so I just wanted to offer that piece too.
I want to say, first of all, thank you to the panelists. I've gleaned so much wisdom from all of you, and just want to like sit around the table and have coffee, tea, or some other beverage and just talk for like, 3 or 4 hours and have some music in the background. And as expected, roll out some good food because, that's how we get down. But, I think truthfully, I spend more time right now dealing with the aftermath of queer and trans death. And on the upside, the death of despair in queer and trans people while they live. And perhaps I'm a despair death doula, because we are all possibilities to allow people to see that perhaps as dire as it may feel, there is hope. There is hope and possibility of love and fullness and those kind of things that we aren't taught are possibilities. I made the mistake of watching The Celluloid Closet last on the plane here to Orlando, and the way all the films have us, you know, either killing ourselves or someone murdering us, and that is seen as some kind of justice. And while we do die, and dying is a part of living, while we yet live, there is much fullness for us to participate in, and I am mighty damn joyous about that. And I am now in the dark and standing out in the middle of nowhere, so I'm going to sign off now. I am sorry I'll miss all the Q&A. I wish I could stay. Thank you for tolerating my weird transition attendance. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pastor Lewis. It's been such a pleasure to have you. And actually, we're really coming up just to the hour. So I've kind of been just sprinkling in a little bit of what's been going on in the chat into just some of our past few moments of conversation. Yeah, you know, especially from Pastor Lewis, I'm sorry you won't be able to hear it, though this is being recorded. Shout out to all of you who are watching via the recording. Thank you so much for watching and being with us, even if you're temporarily not with us, but I feel you. Yeah, I think speaking to something Pastor Lewis was really just some truth was naming earlier, you know, Andy at Reimagine just sort of put in the chat, wanting to sort of respond for this, you know, the desire for mainstream institutions to acknowledge and own harm. And maybe it wasn't what I was thinking, but maybe actually in closing, Stephanie, I don't know if you'd be willing to just share a little, even just in our last minute, as I know you've been literally in the room with a lot of trans clergy and leaders over the past few weeks, really exploring this. So yeah, I would just love to hear sort of what, you know, not to stand in for every organization out there, but for a nonprofit who is offering funerary services, like how this conversation is kind of landing for you, and maybe like a takeaway or two. I know I'm putting you on the spot. I hope that's okay.
No, not at all. Not at all. I'm first. What an inspiring time this has been. Just really inspiring. I can tell you that this is a conversation, as you know, we started at Plaza a few years ago. And I'm sad to say we were sidelined a bit because of the pandemic. And I really don't need to say what our year was like dealing with those who died during the pandemic. Really took center stage and was our focus. But having said that, I feel really, really optimistic and really uplifted, knowing that we have gathered more traditional clergy around the table to talk about this conversation. Toby Weiss, who's on this call, is part of this conversation. She's also a board member of Plaza. And MJHS is partnering with us so we can make sure that when it comes to end of life and caring for those as we bury or provide services that are requested by the family, that we are ensuring that everyone in the community is being cared for in the most respected ways. As I said initially, I think one of the most important things we can do inside at Plaza, as well as outside in the community, is to have these conversations. And I believe it was Pastor Lewis who started us off and said, we can't care for those we don't see. That to me was so incredibly profound. And that is the message that I will be carrying into our next meeting, which is in a couple of weeks, with this group of people, clergy, mostly clergy, as we go forth on this road. And we know that we need to acknowledge, we need to learn, we need to listen, and we need to come up with a conversation as we move forward. And as I said to the folks at Keshet, not only today, but in conversations in the past, I'm incredibly optimistic. And I feel wonderful about this conversation that we're having. And I think only really good things are going to come from this. So speaking for Plaza, as much as I can speak for Plaza, that's how I feel.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you for putting me on the spot. I'm so happy that you did.
Yeah. And really, I just want to center and presence, and thanks so much, Lindsay, Sid, Rabbi Becky, Q, Pastor Lewis. Oh, this was such a rich, beautiful conversation. So appreciative of your being here and being willing to share, and really, I just especially, just Becky, the comment you made about sort of the way in which in your own work you've had to put your body on the line, you've had to put your being on the line. I am, I just want to recognize the ways in which all of you and any of you here who have that experience, just acknowledge that and acknowledge the grief that you healthily deserve to be able to have around that, and the justice that you deserve moving forward. And I just hope that this conversation can just start to even be a way for that to happen. So I apologize that we're out of time. And I thank you all so much for being here, and stay healthy, stay safe, have a beautiful summer. And I hope we get to convene more conversation like this soon. Thank you all.